My name's David, and the Chronological Bible Reading for August 23rd is Jeremiah chapters 49 and 50. Judgment against more of Judah and Israel's enemies. It may be helpful for us as we read through these chapters to think about our own enemies, not in the natural sense, but in the spiritual sense. Chapter 49 begins with a prophecy about judgment against Ammon. The Ammonites were descendants from Lot, and in a spiritual sense, this would refer to the people we should be able to trust. Lot was Abraham's nephew, but unfortunately, differing priorities brought us to different destinations, and we are now at a place where we can only depend on those who are of a like precious faith. But ultimately, we can only even trust them because God has said so. Yahweh says, "Why has Milcom," which is another name for Molech, the god to whom people would sacrifice their children, "why has Milcom dispossessed Gad and his people settled in their cities? Why are there pagans worshiping idols and sacrificing their children in the places that are supposed to be possessed by spirit-filled believers?" In verse 2, Israel will dispossess their dispossessors, says Yahweh. They will kick out those who have kicked them out. Many Christians today, because they've heard the voice of God and they want to be obedient to what God is saying, they've been exiled from the church. And a lot of churches today are not worshiping the true God, they're worshiping false gods. And for instance, those who approve of abortion are literally promoting child sacrifice in their churches. There will come a day when the Most High God pours out wrath and judgment on the people who claim to be representing and worshiping Him, but are so far from Him, they don't even realize they will be objects of His wrath unless they repent. In verse 7, he begins pronouncing judgment against Edom. It's a reference to Esau, and as we read through these verses, we see Esau mentioned by name. It is the mindset of somebody who is self-reliant. They don't need anyone else. Just like Esau, who was a mighty hunter, he was willing to forsake his birthright for a bowl of stew. He was the brother of Jacob, who became Israel, and he is the father of the Arab peoples today. This is a reference to people who have the bloodline of Abraham, yet they're walking according to the flesh and relying upon themselves rather than humbly submitting to God and living by faith. God says, "I will bring Esau's calamity upon him." That's a reference to Esau forsaking his birthright. The very reason for which he was born, he forsook for immediate gratification. In verse 10, God says he will try to hide, but he will not succeed, and his descendants will be destroyed. In verse 12, if those who do not deserve to drink the cup must drink it, how could you possibly go unpunished? This is a reference to tribulation. The New Testament spells it out clearly for us. We are to embrace hardship and tribulation and look at it as an opportunity to grow. We are supposed to rejoice in it and thank God for it, because we know that through the process of embracing hardship and going through suffering, God is bringing about in us growth of the greatest kind that will surpass even death. He is drawing out of us selfishness, laziness, all kinds of depravity. The reason that Jacob had to go through working for Laban for 20 years was so that he would learn patience and he would learn the heart of God. Esau didn't go through those things, and he was not changed, but Jacob was. It is through the process of embracing suffering and rejoicing in our suffering that we become spiritually mature. And it's by that process that God will have His way in our hearts. God, through Jeremiah, is saying there in verse 12, if the righteous person who doesn't even deserve to suffer is embracing suffering, how much more so will the person who does what is evil need to suffer? In verse 16, you elevate your nest like the eagles. You pump yourself up. I will bring you low, says Yahweh. In verse 29, he turns his attention to Damascus. Damascus was a rich and wealthy city. It was the capital of Syria, and it's a reference to depending on wealth. In verse 28, Kedar refers to Palestine, and Kedar was a son of Ishmael. Of course, Ishmael was created by Abraham when he tried to force God's promise into being in the flesh. That never ends well. When God gives us a promise, let's wait upon God to fulfill it. The offspring of our own fleshly actions will always come back to bite us. But there's coming a day when God will even remove those things from hindering us, and we will be set free to truly worship him in spirit and in truth. In verse 34, Elam is brought up. Elam means distant or hidden, and we see a reference to his bow that will be broken. The spiritual enemies that want to snipe you from afar will be cut off, says God. Chapter 50 begins the prophecies about the fall of Babylon and how Babylon will be captured. Bel, or Baal, in verse 2, will be put to shame. Marduk, the god of confusion who was worshipped by the Babylonians, is terrified. Her idols put to shame, her false gods devastated. In those days and at that time, declares Yahweh, the Israelites and the Judeans will come together, weeping as they come, and will seek Yahweh their God. They will come and join themselves together with him in a permanent covenant that will never be forgotten. God says, my people were lost sheep. Their shepherds led them astray. They wandered from mountain to hill. Mountains and hills are references to leaders. The higher the peak, the more of a following they have. Their adversaries said, we're not guilty. Instead, they have sinned against Yahweh. The religious system that props ill-equipped men and women up into positions of power and authority is Babylon, and it is falling. If you've been hurt by a ministry leader and that ministry leader is unwilling to take responsibility, come out of Babylon. Do not support them with your time or your money. Jesus said he is the true shepherd. His sheep know his voice and they follow him. Listen to him, listen for his voice, and may he bless you as you do so. We'll see you tomorrow.